I was the partner Patrick had once begged for on his knees, yet I had become nothing more than a pathetic joke he discarded without a second thought. A freak masquerading as a woman? Daunt sickened me with that life-saving debt nonsense. He didn't just watch my agony with cold indifference. He personally used me as a betting chip, packaging me up and throwing me straight into the bed of his unimaginably powerful young uncle. His friends teased him, such a breathtaking merman. Aren't you terrified someone might actually take a taste? Patrick's laughter dripped with absolute disdain and certainty. My uncle's standards are astronomically high. Why would he ever touch a fish that reeks of the sea? Besides, merfolk are fiercely loyal. Hez, so madly obsessed with me, had died before letting anyone else lay a finger on him. A few months later, in the dead of night, Patrick called, his tone heavy with a condescending, arrogant charity. The bet has expired. Crawl on back. But the only response he received was my unbearable, trembling, muffled moan. On the other end of the line, Patrick's breathing instantly stalled. His voice shook violently. What the hell are you doing? A large, searing, hot hand, dead, locked around my waist from behind. The man's lazy, low chuckle crashed through the receiver, carrying the absolute domination and wicked arrogance of a true apex predator. Why don't you guess, dear nephew? In this mansion wrapped in superficial glamour, the sunlight always seemed somewhat biased. The warm golden rays of the afternoon, which should have danced gently across the merman's silver hair, instantly froze into a ghastly frost the second they met Patrick's eyes as cold and sharp as blades. Once, Oscar was the precious treasure Patrick had begged for. Now, amidst this raucous high society gathering, he had been reduced to the most insignificant of ornaments. Patrick sat in the deep shadows of the leather sofa, an unlit cigarette pinched between his fingers. He didn't even bother to lift an eyelid, his voice dripping with a chill that could cause frostbite. Hez just a nanny. Ignore him. The gentle atmosphere that had been drifting through the room instantly collapsed at those words. The so-called friends erupted into grating, mocking laughter. Their gazes slithered like sticky, venomous snakes across Oscar's jawline, which was slightly pale from extreme tension. Go back to your room. Patrick waved his hand in irritation. Every single word was like a resounding slap to the face. Do you really think you're some fairy waiting for compliments? Oscar lowered his feathered eyelashes, concealing the fragmented glimmer in his eyes. He turned around, shutting the vicious threat about plucking all his scales outside his bedroom door. He curled up in the dark, his fingertips trembling slightly from absolute terror. Merfolk were terrified of pain, and Patrick had once been his sole source of warmth in the abyssal sea. But the brief silence was quickly shattered. When he was once again shoved into the center of the brightly lit living room, a sick gamble centered around tears was already brewing. I heard a merman's tears turn into pearls. Someone approached step by step, their voice laced with malicious excitement. Patrick, why don't you make your wife cry for us? Patrick let out a disdainful scoff. Leaning back, sinking into the astronomically expensive upholstery, his eyes were as dead and cold as ice. His skin is too thick. He couldn't cry if he tried. The shoving, the startling, even the deliberate, calculated humiliation, none of it could force even a trace of moisture into Oscar's deep, ocean-like eyes. He stood there like an exquisite porcelain doll, letting the surrounding malice warp the ambient light into a roaring storm around him until a man who had called him sister, Law suddenly lowered his voice, speaking with a trace of unbearable hesitation. Oscar, the moon is incredibly full tonight. Are you homesick? In that exact instant, the chaotic background noise of the massive hall seemed to be instantly muted. Oscar's pupils violently contracted. In that moment, it was as if he could smell the salty, humid sea breeze from the deep ocean, the very breeze Patrick had strictly forbidden him to mention. The ghastly white lights were instantaneously replaced by a gentle, humid, melancholic blue hue. A thin, dreamlike mist bloomed and spread through the air. Click. The first crystal, clear pearl, crashed onto the freezing marble floor, letting out a crisp sound. Right after came the second, the third. Those weren't just simple tears. They were the shattered fragments of a merman's soul. Patrick's expression turned incredibly ugly in that moment. He shot up, his leather shoes viciously stomping down on those pearls, glowing with a soft luster. His jawline pulled taut to the breaking point from sheer fury, and the air around him visibly warped under the high-pressure tension. A bet is a bet, his voice ground out through clenched teeth, carrying a reckless, destructive cruelty. How do you want me penalized? His friends exchanged ambiguous, venomous glances, suggesting they gift Oscar to that obscenely powerful young uncle, the unfathomable man Patrick had always desperately tried to please. A merman recognizes only one partner in his entire life, and loves only one soul. Oscar's lips parted slightly. His trembling fingernails dug deep into the flesh of his palms, but the only thing he received was Patrick's cold words dropping like a final verdict. Fine. It's settled. Oscar, you wouldn't refuse me, right? Oscar stared at Patrick's blurry silhouette in the dark. In that moment, the absolute last trace of deep blue in the depths of his eyes completely died out. The film of memories quietly faded within the water ripples. Under the colossal full moon all those years ago, a tiny Patrick lay by the edge of the pool. His eyes as bright as stars, he innocently made a vow to the mermaid with the beautiful, massive tail. But that beautiful anticipation was brutally torn apart on the day of his coming-of-age ceremony. The sunlight was blinding as the two confronted each other through the dappled shadows of the trees. When they realized they were both male, the air around Patrick instantly boiled. His furious emotions manifested into a visible, rolling heat wave that scorched the surrounding leaves until they were curled and yellowed, slicing the ambient light into chaotic, dark fragments. How the hell are you a guy? He paced like a cornered beast, hurling the cold rejection of the engagement along with that so-called blood money right at Oscar. Because he had mistaken Patrick's braid, Oscar had instinctively shifted his gender for his partner, only to be met with, what a complete waste of a face. Oscar lowered his eyelids. His pale fingertips gripped the shell necklace he had hand, polished so tightly that the rough edges dug stark white, bloody crescent moons into his palms. He knew perfectly well that a beastman whose engagement was broken had absolutely no path left but death. However, this desperate, dead end fate was forcefully overturned by a black sedan parked in the shadows. The window only rolled down a narrow slit. That unseen young uncle's voice was deep and remarkably gentle. With his words, the surrounding air, which had been warped and scorched by Patrick's fury, was instantly, quietly blanketed by a deep blue undercurrent as silent and encompassing as the abyssal sea. Even the blinding sunlight became soft and dense under this power. Patrick was suppressed so entirely by this unyielding, quiet authority that he couldn't move an inch. His tight jawline trembled slightly, and in the end he was forced to swallow all his bitter resentment. Who could have imagined that tonight, years later, Oscar would actually be packaged up and gifted to this unseen savior? Inside the cramped guest room, the dim yellow wall lamp cast a lonely shadow. Oscar quietly folded his clothes into a black suitcase. The only other person there was the young man who had made him cry, leaning against the door frame, restlessly rubbing his flushed hands. Sorry, the man mumbled, his gaze falling on the pale shell resting beside Oscar. Even a complete stranger he had just met could read the homesick agony in his back as he stared blankly out the window, yet the man who was his husband in name was entirely blind and deaf to it. Oscar snapped the locks on the suitcase shut with a crisp clack. He slowly lifted his head. The flush at the corners of his eyes hadn't completely faded, but a faint, shallow curve pulled at his pale lips. There was no resentment, only ultimate tranquility. A flash of unbearable pity crossed the man's eyes. Muttering softly, what kind of lunatic sends his own wife to someone else's bed? He turned and left, dragging his suitcase down the corridor. The leaping bonfire in the garden dyed the night sky a frantic dark orange. A wave of heat swept in, accompanied by the chaotic clinking of wine glasses. By the bonfire, Patrick leaned lazily in a wicker chair. My uncle's standards are astronomically high, head never like a fish that reeks of the sea. He swirled his wine glass, the firelight dancing in his malicious pupils, delivering an absolute verdict. Besides, merfolk are all about absolute loyalty. Hez madly in love with me, had never let anyone else touch him. Through that murky, scorching wave of heat, their eyes abruptly locked in the night wind. This time, Oscar did not flinch or look away. He stood quietly right at the boundary where the shadows met the firelight. In that moment, the thin, rigid line of his spine completely relaxed. He tilted his head up slightly, his soft silver hair glowing with the gentle luster of a pearl under the bright moonlight. Looking at Patrick's face, which seemed incredibly foreign under the firelight, his pale lips finally curved upward, blooming into the very first, and absolutely only, breathtaking smile of sheer relief he had shown all night. That scorching, anxious aura belonging to Patrick that had always kept him shackled was completely, permanently shut out. Oscar turned his back, stepping into the cool, gentle night, whispering softly in his heart, "Goodbye, Patrick." Despite it all, Oscar was still somewhat terrified. The bloody rumors surrounding Edward, seizing absolute power, imprisoning his own blood relatives, driving an old lover completely insane. Those names that had simply evaporated into the shadows made the knuckles gripping the doorknob turn a ghastly, bloodless white. However, pushing open that heavy oak door, what greeted him was not a man-eating beast, but a steady, encompassing halo of amber light. Edward sat behind a massive desk, his gold-rimmed glasses catching the warm glow of the reading lamp. This crushing, absolute authority of a man at the apex didn't make the air in the room biting cold. He raised his eyes slightly, his gaze carrying an extreme, piercing intensity. "Patrick is a fool acting out, and you just follow along with his nonsense." Oscar lowered his head, his fine silver hair hiding the turbulent waves in his eyes. "I am willing to stay." Edward's brow arched in a curve dripping with absolute power and tension. His gaze swept over Oscar's rigid shoulders like a physical weight. "Go take a shower." The bathroom mirror was heavily clouded with thick white steam. Oscar stared at the lone towel hanging on the rack, his hand hovering, paralyzed by a memory. In his mind, a mistake as simple as using the wrong towel had once triggered a storm. Patrick's face, distorted in the harsh light, had radiated a suffocating, dark mud of rage that seemed to physically trap him. "I don't care if you've sealed your scent. That revolting, fishy stench follows you everywhere." Patrick had snarled, violently tossing the towel into the trash and leaving Oscar shivering in a room as cold as a tomb. "Sir." Oscar's damp head peeked through the crack of the door, his long eyelashes trembling with unease. "Is there another towel?" Edward's towering silhouette was cast against the frosted glass. "Is mine not good enough for you?" The deep rumble of his laughter vibrated through the glass and into Oscar's very soul. Then, a large, elegantly jointed hand hovered against the glass, right where Oscar's cheek was. "Or are you testing me? Hoping it'll come in there and dry you off myself." Oscar recoiled instantly. A single crystalline bead of water traced a frantic path down his flushed neck as he scrambled to pull the door shut. Later, as Oscar lay rigid on the massive bed, his mind racing with desperate escape routes, the mattress sank beside him. Edward's presence drew closer. There was no disgust, no rejection. As Edward approached, the air around Oscar, which had been stagnant with terror, suddenly bloomed with a soft, luminescent, cerulean glow. This visual manifestation of his merman essence rippled through the dim bedroom like moonlight on water, tenderly illuminating the space between them. Edward watched this shimmering azure light, a flash of surprise in his deep eyes. This glow. "I use so much soap," Oscar whispered, his eyes rimmed with red, his voice trembling with a desperate fragility. "Is that disgusting smell still there?" "Disgusting?" Edward let out a low, magnetic chuckle, his finger tracing the edge of the cerulean aura in the air. "This is the purest light of the deep sea. It's breathtaking." Before Oscar's nerves could fully settle, a warm, broad palm covered the flat of his stomach without warning. Oscar pulled taut like a bowstring. "Mermen have such perfectly sculpted lines. Let me see." Edward's voice was laced with an unmasked, irresistible magnetism. The next second, Oscar's wrist was captured in an unyielding grip and pressed against a wall of hard, blistering abdominal muscle. "What do you think?" "It's so big." The words tumbled out before Oscar could stop them. His face and neck instantly burned a deep crimson, and he tried frantically to yank his hand back. I didn't mean it like that." Edward's chest rumbled with a joyous, low vibration. "So shy. Surely in these past 2.5 years, even without a certificate, you've at least once. How could they have?" Oscar closed his eyes. That hollow marriage had been nothing more than a cold, ticking contract. On their wedding night, a drunken Patrick had kicked open the door, cloaked in a frantic, crimson shadow of violence. "Are you taking it off yourself, or do I have to do it?" Under that heartless gaze, Oscar had shed his clothes piece by piece. Patrick's eyes had scraped across him like a rusted blade, his lip curling in a sneer. "You're a freak, but am not." The slam of that door had permanently severed Oscar's hope for love. Splash! The ice of those memories melted under the heat of a palm. In the present, Edward's dry, warm hand firmly enveloped Oscar's freezing, trembling fingers. Under Edward's appeasement, the shimmering blue ripples of light finally ceased their frantic shaking, merging into a healing golden radiance. "You are perfect." He was just too blind to see his own luck. Edward's voice was steady and absolute, a force capable of smoothing over any wound. Sleep. The morning sun sliced through the massive floor to ceiling windows, casting sharp lines of light across the expansive suite. After the butler bowed and retreated, Oscar stood before a white porcelain tub, his eyelashes fluttering. The water inside had been precisely mixed to the salinity of the deep sea, glowing with a faint, ethereal blue light beneath a veil of breathing mist. "The master said you've been away from the ocean too long. He noticed your skin was dry and ordered this prepared." The butler's words echoed in his mind, accompanied by a gentle, warm orange aura that quietly dismantled the icy defenses Oscar had built up. He shed his clothes and lowered his pale, parched body into the water. The waves wrapped around him like a soft embrace. The luminescent blue rose from the depths to meet the silver scales on his skin, letting out a faint, melodic hum of rebirth. Yet, in that ultimate silence, a memory tore through the peace like a jagged blade. Oscar, huddled under a showerhead, his parched tail seeping crimson from dehydration. Outside, Patrick's manic pounding on the door was accompanied by a warped, scorching red shadow that bled through the walls. "You're a man. Why the hell are you in there so long like a woman? Do you think the water is free?" That roar had been followed by a shell necklace being hurled against the freezing tile. It was the one and only token of a merman's life. Patrick's lip had curled in disdain, a piece of trash made of broken shells. "I'll buy you a dozen jewels and call it even." In that moment, Oscar's fragile blue light had been brutally pulverized, replaced by a suffocating dark mud as his bleeding fingers tried to gather the shattered pieces. Knock, knock. A steady rap on the door jolted Oscar back to reality. He sat up abruptly, water droplets cascading down his sculpted Apollo's belt. The door was slightly ajar. Edward's towering frame stood backlit by the hall's warm amber lighting, which traced a golden trim along his broad shoulders. Dangled from his long fingers was that very shell necklace, once thought lost to the ruins of the past. Looking closely, the cracks had been perfectly mended with threads of fine silver, refracting the light like miniature veins of stardust. "I saw you clutching it in your sleep last night. It must be precious to you. I took the liberty of having it mended with silver." Edward's voice was deep and magnetic. As he approached, a steady, encompassing amber glow flooded the room like a tide, chasing away the last of the chill. Oscar took the necklace in both hands, his thumbs tracing the silver threads in disbelief. A moist, tender pink flushed the corners of his eyes. "Thank you, Mr. Edward. You're such a good man." Edward arched a brow, his intense gaze shifting from the necklace to the damp, elegant line of Oscar's neck. He let out a low chuckle, leaning in until his shadow, heavy with a powerful, commanding presence, completely enveloped Oscar. Oscar, giving out good man cards so easily, it might actually hurt someone's feelings. That sudden surge of aggression made Oscar's heart skip. He instinctively tightened his grip on his towel, looking up with a desperate need to prove his worth. "I'll do anything for you. I can run errands, cook, clean, I can even arrange." Before he could finish, the amber glow around Edward darkened, surging with a wave of dark gold tension. His eyes were a storm of anger, pity, and a nameless aching pain. Oscar recoiled, the bloody rumors of this man's iron-fisted rule flashing through his mind. He squeezed his eyes shut, but the storm never came. A broad, dry palm, burning with heat, gently swept a lock of damp hair from his cheek. Edward's voice was impossibly low and tender. "Oscar, you don't have to do anything. Just be yourself." In the kitchen, sunlight through the blinds illuminated the flour dancing in the air. Edward, usually seen in bespoke suits and absolute authority, had his sleeves rolled up, facing a mess of cracked bowls and spilled ingredients. When Oscar offered to help, Edward had refused without a second thought. The birthday boy shouldn't be the one in the kitchen. The birthday boy. Oscar froze. Time seemed to stretch. The bitterness he had buried so deep began to flood back. Once, he had walked to Patrick's door, heart fluttering, holding a bowl of birthday noodles he had made himself, only to be met with a cold, "Don't bother me." The next morning, he had watched those noodles covered in a thick layer of cold oil, being dumped into the trash along with every ounce of his love. Now, A bowl of simple, almost crude noodles was placed before him. In the depths of Edward's eyes was the reflection of Oscar's stunned face. The warm light around the man seemed enough to melt him whole. Happy birthday, Oscar. It's a bit rough this year, but I promise, it'll do better next time. Next time. Oscar's lips trembled. The moisture he had been holding back finally transformed into a round, perfect pearl, crashing onto the wooden table. He bit his lip and nodded fiercely. Make a wish. Anything in the world, and I will give it to you. When Oscar brought up wanting a job, excitedly gesturing about how he was especially good at fighting and could use his massive tail to knock enemies unconscious, the poison Patrick had planted in him flared up once again. He said, I reek of the sea. That calculating. That the absolute worst partner in the world. Oscar's voice grew smaller and smaller. The light that had just sparked in his eyes dimmed, and a dark, ashen mist of self-loathing began to bleed into the air around him. My clever Oscar. Edward's large hand steadily cupped the back of his head. His thumb rubbed the soft flesh behind Oscar's ear with undeniable, absolute magnetism. That powerful amber halo instantly shattered every trace of the ashen mist. Your tail must be massive and breathtaking. When the time is right, will you let me see it? He looked straight into Oscar's panicked eyes, his words dropping like heavy stones, clear and resonant. You are my partner now, and you smell incredible. Holding you is cool and comfortable. A few days later, inside a top-tier boardroom defined by cold, harsh metal lines, Edward sat at the head of the table, flipping through documents, while Oscar, sitting beside him, stared dead at his violently vibrating phone screen. 99 missed calls. The name Patrick flashed on the screen, like some toxic entity oozing a scorching, pungent gray mist, trying to reach through the glass and wrap around his neck once again. Answer it. It might be urgent. Edward spoke lightly, his peripheral vision sweeping over Oscar's pale knuckles. Pushing open the heavy, soundproof doors, the cold draft of the hallway hit his face. Oscar pressed answer. Are you deaf? Patrick's furious roar instantly exploded through the receiver. Along with it came that nauseating, blistering dark red aura of hollow bravado. I lost something. That trash necklace you gave me is gone. I took nothing but my own belongings. Oscar's voice was unexpectedly steady. He looked at the sunlight spilling in from the end of the corridor. The fragile, melancholic blue vapor that usually surrounded him was, bit by bit, condensing into an impenetrable ice blue frost. You didn't even like it, so I took it back. Asking for a gift back. Oscar, you have absolutely zero class. Oscar's grip on the phone tightened, his knuckles turning stark white. The heart in his chest gave a violent lurch, and he suddenly let out a cold laugh. You proposed to me and then gave me away to someone else. Tell me, Patrick, who exactly lacks class? A dead silence fell over the other end of the line. Then came the impotent fury of a man whose nerve had been struck. You think climbing into my uncle's bed makes you untouchable? You just wait. Wait until you come back. It'll teach you a lesson you'll never forget. You are my partner now. You don't need to care about what anyone else says. Edward's voice, laced with absolute control, echoed like thunder in his mind. It formed a golden barrier, completely shutting out that foul, crimson shadow. Expressionless, Oscar pulled the phone away from his ear. Without a single microsecond of hesitation, his thumb hit the red end button. Click. Not just ended, blocked, deleted. The hallway lights seemed unbelievably bright in that moment. Oscar leaned against the freezing wall, his chest heaving violently. He closed his eyes, feeling the sheer thrill of adrenaline spiking through his veins. It was the feeling of completely breaking free from a suffocating abyss, dragging fresh air deep into his lungs for the very first time. It was pure freedom, pure madness. Whose call made you look so happy? Down the hall, Edward's footsteps abruptly stopped. The moment the name Patrick slipped past Oscar's lips, the warm, encompassing amber halo in the air seemed instantly vacuumed of oxygen, dimming at a visible rate. The curve of Edward's mouth was instantly wiped flat. Without another word, he turned, entirely shutting Oscar out behind that heavy mahogany door. The secretary's robotic arm and icy dismissal acted as a merciless rest, cutting off Oscar's pursuit. This suffocating, low atmospheric pressure reminded Oscar of the Beastman base director's warning. Serving a Beastman is like serving a tiger. You have to coax them. You have to capture their stomach. Desperate to chase away Edward's terrifying, dark, gold gloom, Oscar forced down his merman instinct's primal terror of fire and turned into the kitchen. The dining room's overhead lights cast a soft, warm glow. A steaming bowl of seafood congee was placed on the table. Your stomach isn't great. This is good for you. Oscar nervously twisted the hem of his shirt, desperately trying to please him. However, the dark, gold shadows surrounding Edward didn't dissipate. Instead, as his gaze shifted downward, they began to violently boil over. His eyes locked onto Oscar's hand like a hawk. What happened to your hand? Oscar instinctively hid his hand behind his back. A practiced, yet slightly trembling, fawning smile stretched across his pale face. It's nothing. Just a little burn. You smile when you're hurt. You smile when you're miserable. Oscar, are you an idiot? Edward's voice spiked violently, detonating a heavy boom in the air. It was his first time losing control. The tyrannical aura of an absolute apex predator sent a violent shockwave through Oscar's thin spine. The sliver of light that had just sparked in his eyes instantly shattered, dissolving into blank, disoriented terror. Oscar couldn't help but recall the misery of the past. Patrick, sipping delicious fish soup, watching coldly as Oscar soaked his blistered, red hand under cold water, sneering and mocking him for playing the victim. Seeing those panicked, terrified eyes, Edward's rigidly tense jawline abruptly slacked. He closed his eyes, and the churning shadows around him gradually settled into a helpless, heavy undercurrent. I apologize. My words were too harsh. Come here. The massive leather sofa sank. Edward pulled that red, blistering hand onto his knee. Dipping his fingertip into a cooling ointment, he focused entirely on gently spreading it across the swollen skin. He lowered his eyes, his long eyelashes casting soft shadows. Every breath he took felt like a feather brushing against Oscar's overstretched nerves. I want you to express your true feelings. If it hurts, cry. If you're unhappy, get angry. You used to be so full of life. Oscar stared blankly at those gentle hands. Deep in his chest, it felt as though an iceberg were quietly melting. He murmured, I cooked. Because you were angry. I wanted to coax you. Edward's movement stopped. He slowly lifted his head, the gloom in his eyes completely swept clean. A gentle, scorching amber ripple returned to the depths of his pupils. I wasn't angry. I was just jealous. I was jealous that the reason you were smiling so brightly earlier was because of Patrick. Jealous. That word was like a stone, skipping across the dried-up lake of Oscar's heart, kicking up 1,000 ripples. Just as he was about to frantically pull out his phone to prove his innocence, a piercing ringtone violently slashed through the ambiguous warmth. A blocked number flashed on the screen. The moment he answered, Patrick's brutal roar tore through the quiet air like barbed wire. You dare block me? You don't actually think my uncle has fallen for you, do you? Keep dreaming. Has already got someone else in his heart. Someone else. Those words were like an ice pick driven straight from the bottomless abyss, instantly piercing Oscar's heart. The faint, hopeful powder blue halo that had begun to bloom around him from Edward's tenderness met absolute zero in that exact moment. It froze inch by inch, shattered, and ultimately turned into a dead, ashen gray. The warm lights around him rapidly bled of color, fading into a ghastly white. Oscar didn't look to see Edward's reaction. He just stared dead at the cold light reflecting off the table. His pale lips parted, his voice unexpectedly dead and steady. Patrick, I truly despise you. Please do not ever contact me again. End call. Block. All in one smooth motion. My clever Oscar, you did perfectly. Edward's warm, broad hand reached out, carrying an intent to appease, trying to rest on the crown of his head once more. But this time, Oscar snapped his head away. He dodged that warm, amber halo trying to envelop him. He stood up, taking a step back, melting right back into the temperatureless shadows. Even his voice carried a chill meant to keep the world 1,000 miles away. Mr. Edward, I've lost my appetite. I'm going back to my room. Oscar. Edward's low, confused call came from behind, but Oscar didn't look back. His steps only grew faster. He dug his fingernails deep into his freshly bandaged burn, the sharp sting constantly reminding him of the laughable truth. If he already had someone else in his heart, why use that drowning tenderness to provoke him? Why tend to his wounds? Why look at him with such profound eyes and utter a bewitching word like jealousy? The night wind poured in through the crack in the hallway window. Oscar closed his eyes, dragging the pathetic sliver of hope that had just ignited in his heart, along with every flutter he felt for this man, right back down into the freezing, lightless, entirely dead abyss of the sea. However, a sudden rut hit him like a violent, deep sea storm, instantly pulverizing Oscar's forced composure. The luminescent blue water in the bathtub, which originally simulated the tranquility of the deep sea, was now boiling violently under the completely unleashed instincts within Oscar's body, radiating an extremely frantic, blinding blue light. With a massive splash, a colossal, breathtakingly beautiful silver fishtail broke through the surface without warning. The tail fin thrashed against the water in agony, sweeping a priceless vase off the shelf. The shattered white porcelain gleamed coldly amidst the flooded floor. Rapid footsteps echoed from the hallway. The door was violently thrown open. "Don't come in. Don't look at me." Oscar curled into the corner of the tub in absolute terror, his arms desperately wrapping around the massive tail he had nowhere to hide. His normally pale skin was flushed with large, feverish patches of crimson due to the searing heat of his rut. Even the corners of his eyes were wet and red with absolute humiliation. Yet, the disgust he expected never came. As Edward stepped inside, the furious, out of control blue light that had engulfed the bathroom was instantly, completely swallowed by a steady, rich, and incredibly warm amber halo. This aura, belonging to a man of absolute authority, carried no oppressive weight, only endless, bottomless appeasement. That is a massive, incredibly beautiful tale. Edward crouched before the bathtub, backlit by the light. The eyes behind his gold-rimmed glasses were so deep they could drown a man. Ignoring the shattered chaos on the floor, he bent down. His arms slid firmly under Oscar's arms and behind his knees, effortlessly scooping the blistering merman straight out of the water and into his embrace. Oscar instinctively tried to resist, but that warm amber scent was too intoxicating to refuse. His trembling arms uncontrollably looped around Edward's broad shoulders. When he was placed onto the soft, massive bed, Oscar curled into a tight ball of discomfort. A moment later, a blistering, solid chest pressed against his back. That massive, shimmering silver tail, seemingly possessing a mind of its own, quietly and possessively wrapped itself around Edward's lean waist. They all say I've had countless bed partners, but over all these years, Edward's warm thumb gently wiped the cold sweat from Oscar's temple. His voice was deep and slightly hoarse, every vibration transferring directly through their touching skin and straight into Oscar's heart. In my heart, I've secretly kept only one person, and that person is you. That confession dropped like thunder on a clear day. Through Edward's low narrative, a dust-covered memory slowly unfurled before Oscar's eyes, years ago, on a coastline under a brutal, blistering sun. A tiny merman, having fainted from the heat, was thrashing agonizingly on the sand. It was a passing Edward who had carried him back into the sea. You had a face that made people want to commit a crime even back then. If I hadn't retained a shred of sanity, I would have taken you home right then. Edward let out a soft chuckle. He looked down at Oscar, whose lips were slightly parted in sheer shock, and dropped the bombshell that completely pulverized his old dreams. "So, my little Oscar, what exactly did you do with the hairbands, bracelets, and snacks I had sent to the base all those years ago?" His pupils violently contracted. Oscar bit his lower lip hard, his fingernails digging deep into the bedsheets. So, it turned out that the faint light that had sustained him through countless freezing dark nights, the tenderness that Patrick had casually claimed as his own, had, from the very beginning, belonged solely to the man behind him. The extreme shock, coupled with the searing heat of the rut, instantly drained the last ounce of Oscar's strength. Enveloped in that infinitely warm amber halo, he fell into a deep, heavy slumber. When he woke again, the room was filled only with tranquil sunlight. However, that tranquility was quickly shredded by the frantic vibration of his phone on the nightstand. A string of unfamiliar numbers continuously flashed on the screen. The moment Oscar pressed answer, Patrick's exhausted, neurotic, and weak panting crawled through the receiver. In the air, the highly unsettling, dark, red, anxious shadows that belonged to Patrick faintly materialized. "I can't sleep." Patrick's voice carried a grievance and begging he himself hadn't even realized. "Oscar, why is it that without you here, even falling asleep has become so difficult?" Of course it was difficult. In the past, it was Oscar who endured a parched, agonizing throat every single night, singing the merman's most precious requiem to slowly smooth over Patrick's manic nerves, ravaged by emotional illness. And that merman, the one he had sneered at and mocked for being self-righteous, had now withdrawn his absolute sanctuary. "Oscar, will you come back? Please, will you sing for me again?" That dark, red, anxious shadow writhed and begged frantically on the other end of the line. Oscar lowered his eyes slightly. Not a single ripple disturbed the clear depths of his pupils. The luminescent blue glow surrounding him was calm and unbreakable, effortlessly blocking out all the frantic mania trying to invade. No. That single syllable was like the sharpest ice blade. A sharp, explosive crash of a glass shattering against a wall violently rang out through the receiver. Oscar stared expressionlessly at the distant mountains outside the window. His voice was as cold as a temperatureless spring. "If you can't sleep, take sleeping pills. And don't call me in the middle of the night ever again. You might not be able to sleep, but I'm very tired." He severed the call without a single trace of attachment. The warm sunlight in the room remained unchanged. That vicious shadow, begging for pity in the dark, was permanently shut out of a world that absolutely did not belong to him anymore. The afternoon sunlight was sliced into dappled patterns by the blinds, spreading quietly across Edward's massive desk. Oscar lowered his eyelashes, his fingertips pinching a heavily crumpled piece of stationery. The handwriting on the letter was twisted, looking exactly like a trapped beast struggling in sheer despair. Using long, chaotic, and disorganized sentences, Patrick confessed his belated, agonizing remorse, his delayed realization of merman nature, and his pathetic attempt to use that taken shell necklace to beg for one final chance. However, this deeply delayed affection could no longer stir even a single ripple within the tranquil, deep sea like luminescent blue halo surrounding Oscar. Edward's towering frame approached silently. His deep gaze quickly swept over the letter, a trace of an apex predator's disdain pulling at the corner of his mouth. Ugly handwriting. "Reads like a grade schooler's diary. It seems I was too lax with his discipline." His long fingers absent-mindedly snatched the letter away and tossed it casually onto the corner of the desk. With that single motion, a highly aggressive, yet exceptionally warm, dark, gold halo instantly enveloped the space around Oscar. Edward leaned in slightly, the eyes behind his gold-rimmed glasses bottomless. "Since you've rejected the nephew's plea for peace, would you consider your young uncle?" Oscar didn't answer. He suddenly threw his head back, his hands fiercely grabbing Edward's crisp shirt collar. He closed his eyes and crashed his slightly pale lips viciously against the man's. In that very instant, the air in the entire room seemed to ignite. The ice-blue water vapor surrounding Oscar, which had been in a constant state of defense, instantly melted into a pool of passionate spring water the second it touched Edward's searing lips. That commanding, dark gold halo acted like a waking beast, completely swallowing and wrapping up that tiny cluster of fragile blue light. It intertwined around them, forming a blinding, breathtaking waterfall of brilliant light. The night was deep. On the massive double bed, the air still carried the thick, sweet stickiness left over from their intense heat. The dim wall lamps stretched the silhouettes of their intertwined bodies into long shadows. The corners of Oscar's eyes were flushed with a decadent red, his drained body sinking into the soft pillows. His pale back was covered in ambiguous red marks. Edward lay on his side next to him, radiating a lazy, satiated, warm orange glow. His warm thumb was gently kneading Oscar's sore lower back. Suddenly, the phone on the nightstand abruptly lit up, its cold screen piercing the warm sanctuary. It was an unknown number. The moment it was answered, Patrick's suppressed tremor of excitement and anticipation sounded incredibly harsh in the quiet bedroom. "Did you read the letter? The bet is over. Please come back." Hearing that voice, Edward's narrow eyes squinted slightly. A cold, highly possessive glint flashed in the depths of his eyes. His large hand resting on Oscar's waist abruptly tightened. Caught entirely off guard, a stifled, unbearable moan spilled from the back of Oscar's throat, his long legs instinctively curling up. The breathing on the other end of the line stopped instantly. Then came Patrick's violently trembling demand. "What the hell are you doing?" Edward let out a low, joyous chuckle. That dark gold aura belonging to an absolute apex predator arrogantly crushed its way through the airwaves, completely obliterating the anxious currents that had tried to invade. "Why don't you guess, dear nephew?" "Uncle?" "That's impossible. Didn't you already have someone in your heart?" "I do have someone in my heart." Edward lowered his head, his high nose bridge intimately nuzzling Oscar's flushed ear. His voice was deep, dripping with a malicious, terrifying tenderness. "And isn't this perfect?" My nephew was so filial, he delivered the love of my life right into my bed. "Patrick, your uncle will remember this favor." His cheeks burning, Oscar exasperatedly grabbed Edward's wandering hand, shooting him a fierce glare. That single shimmering glance made Edward's Adam's apple bob. He chuckled lightly, delivering the final verdict through the phone. "Whether the bet is over or not isn't up to you to decide. Go play by yourself. My little fish is making eyes at me." The call was cleanly severed, throwing the dead silence of the man on the verge of a breakdown back into the dark. A few days later, the sunlight outside the floor, ceiling windows looked ghastly pale. The air in the corner of the cafe was so stagnant, it was suffocating. An iced Americano was pushed in front of Oscar, the black liquid reflecting Patrick's paper, white face. His eyes were heavily bloodshot. The arrogant, dark, red aura that used to surround him had completely collapsed into a visible, ashen, decaying fog, clinging desperately to his trembling shoulders. "This is the first time you've ever bought me coffee." Oscar sat with his spine perfectly straight. A tranquil, indestructible ice, blue halo flowed around him, completely shutting out the pitiful, fawning gray mist radiating from Patrick. Patrick's lips trembled for a long time before he finally managed to squeeze out a single agonizing question. When did you stop loving me?" Oscar didn't answer. His clear gaze acted like a scalpel, precisely slicing open Patrick's hypocritical shell. "Do you remember that time you came back reeking of alcohol, pinned me to the bed, and kissed me? How you stopped halfway just to humiliate me, and then went to the bathroom to frantically rinse your mouth out?" At that nonchalant recounting, the blood instantly drained from Patrick's face. The gray mist around him began to tremble violently and peel away. He waved his hands frantically, apologizing incoherently. I just had too much to drink. I'll never do it again." "You weren't drunk at all?" Oscar leaned forward slightly. There was not a single trace of warmth in his eyes, only the absolute calm of someone who saw through everything. "You just spilled liquor on your clothes. There was absolutely no taste of alcohol in your mouth. You wanted to kiss me, but you were too terrified to face your own truth. Patrick, you're a coward, and I do not like cowards." Those words fell like a heavy sledgehammer, utterly pulverizing the last remaining shadows around Patrick. "And that bet," Oscar continued, mercilessly extracting the final poisoned thorn. "You hated people mocking you for having a male partner, yet you were viciously jealous whenever anyone looked at my face. That night, that man complimented me, and he made me cry. You were furious, and that's why you agreed to give me away, just to vent your anger. Isn't that right?" Patrick's eyes instantly lost their focus. He opened his mouth, but not a single sound came out. Having his darkest, most pathetic thoughts completely exposed, he slumped into the chair as if his bones had been siphoned away. "Oh, right. I suppose it doesn't even count as cheating, considering we never actually signed the papers." Oscar stood up, looking down at the completely incinerated ashes of their past. The bright sunlight from outside reflected in his eyes. "Today makes exactly 3 years. Patrick, we are done." Oscar turned around. Without a single trace of attachment, he pushed open the door and stepped into the brilliant, warm light that belonged entirely to him. He left Patrick alone in that freezing seat, completely swallowed by endless remorse and a suffocating ashen gray. Sunlight pierced through the cafe's floor, ceiling windows coating Edward's towering, dignified silhouette nearby in an incredibly reassuring halo of warm gold and amber. He stood there quietly, his profound gaze cutting through the stagnant dust in the air, offering his broad hand to Oscar. Oscar didn't hesitate for a microsecond. He completely extracted himself from Patrick's freezing, decaying gloom and took long strides toward his own light. The moment their fingers intertwined, a luminescent blue glow representing absolute trust bloomed around Oscar, fusing flawlessly with Edward's warmth. Behind him, Patrick stumbled out, his Adam's apple bobbing violently. However, upon seeing their intertwined hands, it was as if he had been dead, locked in place by an invisible wall. "You always talked about love, but you only dared to steal a kiss in the dark, spilling alcohol to fake being drunk." Oscar looked back, not a single ripple remaining in his clear eyes. The ice-blue halo acted as the most impenetrable shield, completely shutting out Patrick's pathetic state. But him, he dares to hold my hand openly in the blinding sunlight. Patrick, your cowardly feelings could never be called love. Patrick's paper, white lips trembled violently. As those words fell, the absolute last trace of gray mist surrounding him completely dissipated in the wind. He stood there like a hollow shell drained of bone and blood, leaving nothing but absolute despair and dead silence in his eyes. The black sedan drove away from the chaotic city center, the surrounding scenery growing increasingly quiet. Inside the narrow cabin, the atmospheric pressure suddenly plummeted. Edward gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles stark white. A highly aggressive, dark, gold shadow boiled out from the depths of his eyes, instantly dead, locking and intertwining with the blue light around Oscar. He faked being drunk to steal a kiss from you? Before the words even settled, the screech of brakes rang out. Edward's towering frame lunged over. It was a kiss heavy with intense, absolute possessiveness and a hidden, gripping anxiety. Searing breaths tangled together. The dark, gold halo crashed like a violent tsunami, completely swallowing Oscar. Within that bone, crushing intensity, Oscar could feel the deep, seated terror hidden within this mature man. Kissed until the corners of his eyes flushed a rippling crimson, he panted slightly as he pushed against Edward's solid chest. Then, as if performing a magic trick, he pulled out a pearl bracelet radiating a soft moonlight and gently, securely clasped it around Edward's prominent, veined wrist. A token of my promise. Oscar tilted his head up, his gaze flowing with a trace of a merman's unique slyness, formed from merman tears. If you dare to not cherish it, I'll slap you with my tail. Looking at that string of crystal, clear pearls, wept by his beloved in a moment of ultimate passion, the dark, gold storm in Edward's eyes instantly settled. It transformed into a gentle spring, capable of drowning a man in tenderness. He let out a low, joyous chuckle, the vibration of his chest transferring straight through their touching skin. The view suddenly opened up. The salty, humid sea breeze swept across the silver beach. A colossal full moon hung right at the boundary where the sea met the sky, coating the churning waves in a layer of shimmering, shattered silver. From behind, Edward enveloped Oscar completely into his broad, warm embrace, intimately resting his chin against the soft flesh of Oscar's neck. It's a full moon. I was afraid a certain fish might get homesick and cry again. This time, I'm here with you. Listening to the deep murmurs at his ear, Oscar looked at that bright moon, which had once made him shed tears of absolute despair. His heart was now as clear as a mirror. Those coincidental probes at the party that had provoked his tears, that conveniently expiring 3-year bet. All his questions melted away into the gentle sea breeze the moment he touched that warmly glowing pearl bracelet on Edward's wrist. As long as this warm halo held him tightly, the moonlight, no matter where it shone, would always be home. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, inside a dim and chaotic bedroom, Patrick sat with bloodshot eyes and a scruffy beard. That childhood friend who had made Oscar cry at the party was currently hiding in a corner, pressing the send button to the other side of the screen, the corners of his mouth pulling into a sly, dark smirk of a completed mission. All those twists of fate had been nothing more than an elaborate, meticulously designed trap set by the mastermind hunter, all to tear up his nephew's marriage contract ahead of schedule. Under that gentle, luminescent pearl light, all the plunder and unbearable past were completely turned over to a new page. As long as that warm amber halo remained, this merman who had endured so many storms would forever stay in this safe harbor belonging entirely to him, deeply loved until the end of time.
And with that, Oscar's story comes to a close. But I truly believe that in the days to come, Oscar will only grow happier and happier, simply because he found a partner who is both incredibly powerful and endlessly gentle. From Oscar's story, we can see just how crucial it is to have a good partner. In the 3 years he spent with Patrick, Oscar didn't have a single happy day. He desperately pleaded within a freezing marriage, ruthlessly suppressing his own nature, falling into deep self-loathing under Patrick's constant humiliation. It was Patrick who had actively pursued him in the beginning, yet the moment he realized Oscar shared his gender, his attitude changed drastically, all because he was too terrified to let anyone know he had fallen for a man. He masked his cowardice with sheer arrogance and hid his true heartbeat behind a wall of apathy and mockery. But love cannot, and absolutely should not, be like that. No one can endure that level of degradation, even if that person loves you more than their own life. On the flip side, Edward wore the cloak of a ruthless, bloodthirsty reputation, yet he provided Oscar with the most absolute, secure sanctuary. He understood Oscar's sensitivity. His heart ached for Oscar's maturity, and he cherished every wound Oscar had ever suffered. Guided by Edward, Oscar slowly found himself again. Edward's love was a meticulously calculated, long, premeditated pursuit. Laced with the encompassing tolerance and guidance of a mature man, it became the safe harbor that healed Oscar completely. I hope everyone out there can find a mature, powerful partner of their own. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, and I'll see you in the next one.